We are back with another episode of Reference Points. This time we are going to be talking about the Omega Seamaster 300. I am joined by my colleagues, our vintage expert, Rich Forden. Rich, how you doing?
Good, thanks, Dave.
And Hodinkee's own lead editor, James Stacy. Hey, James.
What's going on, dude?
We are talking about probably one of the most famous dive watches on the planet, one of the most historically significant watches on the planet, a sub-collection of the broader Seamaster range, which dates back to 1948, but today we're going to be talking specifically about the Seamaster 300. Rich, as sort of our in-house expert and go-to on all things vintage watches, what makes the Seamaster 300 so special and so important?
Yeah, it's important because it's Omega's take at a professional dive watch from the golden era of real tool watches. Beyond that, it's very, very difficult to find these early Seamasters in good condition.
Yeah, I think it's also one of those watches where it has not had a continuous production. I think a lot of the more famous and well-known dive watches, you think the Rolex Submariner, for example, which has had a almost constant production run from its inception in the early 50s through today. That's not the case with the Seamaster 300.
No, 44 years, I think we'll get to that, but big gap.
I think what's special about these, especially the ones that we'll start out with the 2913, the earliest generation, is a lot of the iconography, the interest, the sort of cult of professional series dive watches is where it starts. Like, nobody thinks about a current day, modern, very cutting edge dive watch without considering whatever its first reference was. And with a lot of these, what we see is a very kind of progressive move towards refining the idea of what Omega's dive watch could be and growing the connection in actual diving.
Yeah, I think it's important to focus on where the watch industry was in the 1950s. You're growing up from the standard field watch or work watch on a leather strap and moving into this sort of like full-on super steel bracelet, purpose-driven, purpose-built watch. Rich, why do you think the Seamaster was chosen as the dive watch when historically it wasn't really even a sport watch before this? Because it's sort of a gap between, let's say, 1953 and 1957, where Omega launches the Seamaster, the Speedmaster, and the Railmaster, sort of a tool watch trio.
The Seamaster 300, I think, in 1957 is the ultimate version of what those watches were moving towards, which was water-resistant, dust-resistant, reliable watches you can wear every day. The Seamaster 300, the 2913-1, all the way through -8, and sticking with all of those straight lug cases, they're officially water-resistant, guaranteed to 200 meters or 660 feet. That's not 300. So where does the name come from? So the story goes, Omega dropped a 2913 to the bottom of Lake Geneva and retrieved it, which Lake Geneva is 310 meters at its deepest. The Seamaster 300 comes from the fact that they knew it was better than 200 meters water resistant. And Seamaster 300 just sounds kind of cool too.
It sounds very cool, and I think there's a reason why it doesn't say the Seamaster 300M,
Right.
because it's not an official number.
Right.
So let's start at 1957. What are the hallmarks of the design of an early Seamaster 300?
The very first Seamaster 300, the 2913-1, looks exactly the same as the watch we have here. We have a broad arrow hour hand, a straight seconds hand, and a dial with dagger indices in full radium lume. What's interesting about the dials here is that the lumes are actually recessed into the dial. So if you were to loop, or even with the naked eye, these dagger indices, you can see that they're sunken below the level of the black mat. The calling card of these early 2913s is the straight lug case, as well as the double bezel inlay. So on the outside, you have a very, very thin layer of Bakelite, plastic of the time, as well as a inner steel section that rotates along with the outside. That outer layer is very, very thin and very fragile. You can see we have one that's a little flaked actually, and that gives a good example of how thin this material actually is. There's a slight concave character to that Bakelite, which is really hard to reproduce for even watchmakers who are specializing in reproducing these bezels. These bezels that we have are all original Bakelite. There's no reproduction material on them, which I thought was really important because there's a lot more character in these true vintage examples.
And I think one of the things that's worth calling out if we're talking a bunch about the bezel is you'd expect tension, but that's not what we get, right?
Right. So the bezel on the Seamaster 300 from the very beginning, 60 clicks. That is actually the reason why these watches were used almost immediately when they came out by organizations like Comex. They were used at the very, very highest level because they did have the best bezel of the time.
I think they predate conventional non-friction bezels by multiple decades.
Right, if we're calling out the elephant in the room, the Rolex Submariner does not go 2 clicks for multiple decades.
And these watches were produced both with flat link bracelets and beads of rice like this one?
Right, so the first example that we have here is on its original beads of rice. This watch was sold with both bracelets.
Okay.
The flat link is typically the more common bracelet you'll see on these Omega Sport watches from the time. 19 millimeter lugs, super, super thin and rattly. The story with these is they're incredibly difficult to find now because a lot of owners at the time, even if you bought it on a bracelet, it is very, very jangly and cheap feeling. Either you threw it in a drawer or you threw it away and put it on a strap because they are great bracelets. There's nothing wrong with them technically, but the feel is just very, very vintage and not confidence inspiring. Most of the time you see divers using these in old images outside of advertising materials. They don't use these bracelets.
And I'm curious, speaking of what collectors are into and how difficult it can be to find the bracelet, if you look at the 2913s and the various ones we have here, is there one that stands out against others or one element of a certain, sub-marker that people go really crazy for?
Really, what collectors are looking for is that broad arrow hour hand, which is unique to the first 3 variants. And the lollipop second hand is a nice thing to have. The second hand across 2913s is sort of whatever was in the parts pile between straight and lollipop. Subsequent variants go to a Dauphine hour hand with a small arrow on the minute hand. So if you want that combination of broad arrow hour hand and lollipop second hand, you have to find a -3. That's the most desirable. In my opinion, the small arrow, it's very, very funky and it's very much this watch only. However, it doesn't have like the classic Omega look that big, broad hour hand is, which we'll see in the modern stuff. They bring that back.
So we've got the 2913 as kind of the starting point. What's kind of the next evolution? When does that take effect? We started in 57, what's the next step?
So in 1962, we move into this weird transitional period with the reference 14755. And these watches are very, very similar to the 2913. You see the spear hand, similar to that of a Speedmaster, come in this transition reference. This whole group of 4 watches that we have on the table is a in-between period of 3 years before we move into the lyre lug case. You still have the same dial as the 2913, you still have the same bezel, you have similar hands, but the main difference is the movement. So we move from the 501 movement, and as a part of updating their whole line of movements, in 1962, they came out with the 550. So you get a big bubble caseback on the 2913s. That caseback is relatively flat in comparison because the movement's a little thinner.
Does the weirdness, the changing nature of the design lead to more collectability, or are they somewhat less collectible than, say, a 2913-3?
In general, I would say less collectible just because the watch looks so similar to a 2913, but it's not one. That being said, there are some special variants in this range. For example, like the watch that we have on the table with the very crazed crystal. On the caseback, you'll see FAP, which is the Peruvian Air Force. So in this generation is when we see the first military issued watches from the Omega Seamaster 300 line, which, that always carries more interest in collectability. That watch is actually very, very special.
That's really cool.
The other thing to call out in this generation is there is a dial, which we have one variant of in the transition that is more similar to the ones that we'll find in the next generation of lyre lug cases. This brings us from 1962 to 1964. Omega changed their reference number logic, so the last watch we have on the table there with the baton dial and baton hands is a different reference number.
So yeah, I guess let's move out of the transition and into the next phase of Seamaster, which is sort of the last stand of the Seamaster 300 for some time.
This is also where I think the model kind of found its pace as a true pro diver. We move into screw down crowns, the bezel's even more refined, the water resistance is what you'd expect it to be, and you've also hit sort of toolish design that in my mind at least has a fighting chance at being one of the most beautiful dive watches ever made.
Yeah, so starting in 1963, 64, we have the 164-024 and 166-024, the 66 being the date model. This is where you see most watch guys know the Seamaster 300 as this watch. Although it's short-lived and then the model itself goes away right after this reference, this is the pinnacle for vintage Seamaster 300s. It's just much more serious as a dive watch. You have the larger looms, you have the larger bezel, which is now loomed not only at 12, but at each hour.
It feels mil-spec, even though it isn't.
But it is.
But it is. But that's the thing, right? And it's funny because the one I'm holding feels like a pinnacle, and yet we still don't have the screw-down crown. It's still not quite at its peak.
Yeah, we're still push-pull crowns until 1967. That's also right around the same year that the big triangle comes in. That watch being sort of rare in that it has push-pull crown with big triangle. The big triangle and the non-big triangle dial variants, they are spread throughout the range. So you do get these sword hands in most variants and most examples. You see baton hands in some, which are just the straighter, but equally as large and serious, as well as the big triangle versus non-big triangle. It's just spread throughout the reference and the run.
For collectors, is one more coveted than the other?
I would say for James Stacy when he walked in, it's definitely the sword hand.
I'm a sword hand
big
boy,
triangle.
man,
For sure.
Yeah.
from way back. The bubble on the crystal here and the bezel and that dial and the huge markers, I mean, it's just, these are crazy beautiful watches.
Yeah, the bezel adds such a masculinity to the watch, and the lyre lugs, it takes on a totally different form.
What's cool about these is that the lyre lugs came first on the Seamaster 300. So a lot of people look at those watches as having a Speedmaster inspired case, but in reality, these were designed in 1963. The Speedmaster didn't get a lyre lug until 65, 66. So this is really the watch.
Yeah.
Especially no date, because you get the clean 369 dial. A date's great to have, right? But almost in this generation, it looks a little out of place. So this is really the one to have.
And then moving a little bit later into the 60s towards the, like you hinted at, the kind of the end of the Seamaster 300, we've got a couple here that have some special elements as well, right?
Right, so the three watches that are on NATOs are on NATOs because they need to be. Fixed spring bars made for the British military with the iconic Circle T's on the dial. These are all 164-024s, no dates, fit within the military spec. We have non-big triangle Circle T at the top, and we have big triangle Circle T at the bottom, and non-big triangle Circle T at the bottom as well.
And you were talking to us earlier about how the placement of the Circle T is indicative of potentially who was the one placing it on the dial.
Right, so there is some conjecture to if the Circle T is on the bottom, the British military stamped that T, and if it's on the top, it appears like Omega stamped that T. That is really based in the fact that you see Circle T's at the bottom of the dial that are a little sloppier, and all the ones that are at the top and true, great provenance watches, they're much crisper in their printing. But we know that they were delivered in batches, which is why you see different dial configurations of the same watch. They don't all look the same.
The bezel's so good for a watch of this age.
Yeah.
And
So
to see
true.
the issued markings on the case back. And I don't know, like these, like I said, these are just like stunningly beautiful watches. To have them with the fixed bars on a NATO, these nice like Phoenix style MOD class NATOs, like, I don't know, this is basically perfect. So if we start to talk about the end of the first era of the Seamaster 300, it does coincide with sort of 1970, the MOD sort of work starts to move to other brands. That includes Rolex, and then quite a bit later, CWC, who still produces a watch which looks pretty similar to this day. Omega doesn't return to this design, but in talking about the future of their dive watches, and certainly the next phase, which doesn't include the Seamaster 300, I think it's worth establishing a little bit of context because today this is a very conventional, normal-sized dive watch that would be similar to other dive watches somebody might wear even if they never dive. In 1964, 1967, when we get the screw-down crown, 1970 when they stopped making them, this was a very serious pro-spec, the equivalent of wearing a very big, serious watch today.
Yeah, with the technology at the time in terms of depths and water resistance, it's the most serious dive watch you could have bought, which is, why the British military used it, which is why other very serious companies used it for commercial diving. And that also gets us to, why it went away.
Right.
And I think the interesting part of it going away, from a brand perspective, they're not thinking the way we're thinking. We wish that Omega continued to make the Omega Seamaster 300 because it's one of the best dive watch designs that there are, but a brand is constantly looking forward. And where we lose the Seamaster 300, we get the Ploprof in the 1970s, which is a period of watches that was far more experimental. James mentioning just now that this would have been considered a heavy-duty dive
can you
watch.
imagine then seeing a Ploprof?
Exactly. And you go from the Ploprof into taking this design and toning it down. The Seamaster 120, the Seamaster 200. Just different takes on the original.
Like every other brand we can name from the time, they started out with something kind of serious, tech forward, for professional, and then they realized that the appeal of that, maybe not the exact execution, but the appeal of that is actually quite broad. That's why I still love them now.
Yep.
And so you start to make watches that are a little bit less water resistant or a little bit easier to wear every day, or don't necessarily have fixed spring bars and stuff, like make a watch for the conventional buyer. And I think that's where we see that next generation.
Yeah, I think it's a really good time to really hammer home the point that the watch that we're focusing on is the Seamaster 300. But there's a watch over there on the table near you, Rich, which represents basically Omega's second strike of gold when they came out with the Seamaster Professional Diver 300M, made famous when it was released in 1993 as a quartz watch, which says a lot about where the watch industry was at the time, and a lot more about where Omega has constantly been throughout its history, which is thinking about the modern consumer, thinking about the modern market, and thinking about what those buyers want. And at that moment in time, it's quartz watches. And while this isn't the watch that we're looking at, it represents why you see effectively a 44-year gap between the end of the Seamaster 300 and when we'll eventually get to its return. But this was a pretty radical design, and as a happy accident, became the watch of Pierce Brosnan's James Bond and sort of kicked off what would become a decades-long tradition of James Bond wearing the Seamaster.
These still remain really interesting, fun watches, maybe because of this being the Bond watch, but they're more of an example of what ended and what started. This is mid-90s. If we go into the mid-2010s, we pick up the 300 again.
And in 2014, we are now post-Tudor Black Bay. And with the Tudor Black Bay represented an interest in looking to the past to get inspiration from historical models and bring them into modern day in a thoughtful, more modern-sized kind of package.
Yeah. Obviously with Omega, there's a table full of inspiration here, so they could have picked anywhere, and they literally did go all the way back to the 2913 and modernized from that platform. Almost like, and I don't think this is unfair to say, if they had never stopped making a 2913, there's an argument that they would have landed at the 2014 anyways.
I think what coincides and what leads to the 2014 Seamaster 300 is what I call contemporary vintage watch collecting. The idea of being into vintage watches becomes more and more prevalent in 2009, 2010, and leads to something like the Seamaster 300.
I don't know how many brands at the time were doing faux patina or faux aging to a dial to bring that vintage power into a modern watch. But it's the small details, the recessed markers on this one.
It's like a sandwich style effect.
But it also brings a ceramic bezel with liquid metal injected numerals onto that bezel. It's this combination. They could have very easily, and we'll see this in later models, chosen to go with an aluminum bezel. But we spoke about this, Rich, when we did the Daytona reference points. The look of ceramic actually mirrors a bit more the look of Bakelite. So it feels a bit more right. But as you see, you move from a conventional steel model, like the one we have here, into a whole slew of different options.
And obviously the Omega collectors in the audience will remember the trilogy, right? Which was kind of their attempt, or not attempt, their execution on making a genuine reissue, an almost laser one-to-one of the original model. And where in some ways I look at this watch and I think, well, that could have been the whole line. That could have been all of these. But it's almost like not quite modern enough. It's like Omega was trying to find the right blend between how much of the past do they reference while still making a watch that feels like it fits the other, 1,000 SKUs they probably had at the time.
Yeah, it's heritage inspired, but it's still an Omega made in 2014 or 2016. And we see that almost immediately, right? Like the two-tone Sedna gold and two-tone yellow gold models come out very short after the initial release in 2014, as well as a titanium option. So if they were just looking back at a 2913 and saying, let's make that today, it would be steel, it might be thinner, the clasp might be just as jangly as it was in 1957, but it's not that. It's still a modern Omega. It has a master chronometer, coaxial movement inside of it. It's a whole different thing, but it's inspired by the past.
I think the progression from here to what happens next, so you see this line of Seamaster 300s come in 2014. And then in 2021, rumors started circulating about a new Seamaster 300, an update to that watch. And when it landed, it was not quite what any of us had expected. Here, what you have is an aluminum bezel, but then you have things like a return to the lollipop hand. So there's some of that stuff in there. The arrow hands, you still have recessed markers, but now you have an actual sandwich dial. I mean, Rich, for you, someone who's die-hard vintage, when a watch doesn't actually seem to be calling back to anything in particular, but is just trying to sort of tick certain boxes of what a vintage-inspired watch should look like, how does that land for you?
In that iteration, it lands quite well.
Okay.
I think that is a genuinely modern feeling, genuinely modern looking Omega, yet I have some of the vintage details that I want. Those looms are recessed. It's not a sandwich dial, but they're getting the same effect with a sort of different and more interesting construction with that sandwich dial. The lollipop second hand, I love it.
Yep.
It's great.
And I think it's an interesting example, again, of the way that Omega updates a product. This is a little bit thinner, dial's a little bit bigger, and then of course it's Omega. You're not going to forget the movement. We move from an 8400 series coaxial master to a Meta certified 8900 series, which is a not inconsiderable jump in tech and thinking in very much within Omega's plan for their watches to keep them modern.
Before we get to the end of the line for the modern iteration of the Seamaster 300, let's get goofy for a second. Because while you might think that two-tone dive watches in the modern context is, a little bit off.
It makes sense in the modern sense.
It makes sense historically.
Anything could be a dive.
There are other dive watches that we know that are heavy-duty divers from mid-century that were done in two-tone. So it's not the craziest thing to see, but this might be.
It's close. It's up there.
Because you can't get the sense from seeing me hold this on camera, but I'm holding a platinum Seamaster.
Yeah.
And I know you've written about this watch.
Yeah, I was lucky enough a few years ago to throw out a silly idea when this was announced, or maybe when I first held it, and I was like, oh, wait. This is insane. This thing weighs like more than half a pound. It's the better part of 300 grams. And otherwise it is like entirely stealthy. And I think that's something that sets Omega apart. And we see even more of that with some of the funkier dial executions on the table.
I know, Rich, you were showing James some of these dial iterations already, but let's speak to what's going on over here a bit.
Let's start with this green one.
Yeah.
I dressed for this watch today, although not bright enough.
So starting in 2018, we see these come from Omega. We have platinum case metal with a malachite dial. They also did platinum case metal with a lapis dial, as well as both malachite and lapis in yellow gold. It is Omega taking the next step beyond, okay, let's do a normal looking watch in platinum and have it be stealth. But now this is no longer stealth.
Now, to get from the beginning where we started to the end is sort of a jump back to the 2021 iteration series. This year was the 75th anniversary of the Seamaster diving range, so I guess the more sport-oriented Seamaster, and Omega celebrated in a big way. across the entire range, there was sort of this thematic release structure where every watch was blue, and that blue corresponded to basically the depth rating of the watch. So the less the depth, the lighter the blue, the more the depth, the darker the blue. And the way that manifested itself in the new Seamaster 300 is a very blue watch.
Blue on blue on blue.
On blue. Blue lume, it's a blue dial, the ceramic blue bezel, and then a nice sort of traditional closed case back. And Rich, I mean, I turn to you.
You dressed for that one.
This feels like the most outside your wheelhouse.
Yeah, not only because I do wear a lot of blue, and it'd be a little too matchy for me, but I think it's cool. I think it's interesting that Omega went this direction. Nobody knew they were going to do this with this anniversary, right? I mean, that's cool. That's interesting.
Yep.
I really do like the solid case back on all of the watches,
Me
right?
too. Me too.
It's just rare that you see a modern watch with a solid case back, and when you do, it's just, and now it's novel, you know?
It's also worth pointing out, because we did talk about the vintage bracelets feeling fairly light, jangly, like a true vintage bracelet from the 50s. The bracelets on these modern ones, especially the most recent kind of reference, the 21 and on, is a fantastic bracelet. So I think I'm on record saying which one I would probably take home, take me into the mid-60s with a 164, 024, but I'd love to open it up to you guys, and then Rich even expand it into probably, like, if we're missing the most collectible thing on the table here. But if you guys could pocket one of these and, you know, take them home, what are you leaving with?
For me, I'm going with you, James. It's 164024. I think that on the NATO, it brings every aspect of the watch to life.
Yeah.
Every square inch of the case, the shape of the case, the bezel pops off of the watch more when it's not against the stainless steel bracelet. I think that having fixed lugs just speaks to the toolish nature of the watch. Yeah, for me, all the way.
Yeah. What do you figure?
So my favorite watch on the table is just gonna go standard here, the earliest watch.
Yeah.
The earliest 2913 I can find with those broad arrow hands and in the nicest condition. This watch here on the beads of rice bracelet, and it's signed on the dial by Meister, which is a retailer. So rarity on top of rarity, right? You have the 2913-3 is an early reference as well as a double signed dial. This is the one for me for sure.
What about the collector who is looking to get into collecting a Seamaster and maybe looking for that entry point into vintage Seamaster 300 collecting? Are you sacrificing full originality at that point and we'll use the word entry level loosely?
Yeah, I'm never sacrificing originality, and you don't have to. You could go in that 164, 166 range, find something that is maybe not big triangle. Maybe it has color corrected or reloomed hands. As long as they're done well by a watchmaker that specializes in color matching hands. Those sword hands, it's a lot of loom just hanging. It comes unstable, it cracks, and the more and more that we accept color corrected hands as like a collector community, the better for watches like this, because that loom's just not going to last forever. It has a hard time lasting in a Mercedes hour hand, let alone a huge sword hand. So you can go into that generation with 166s and 164s and find something that's still very attractive, original, and find your entry level there.
I think that the line has landed in a really interesting place. You know, it's I don't know where it goes from here, and there's really never much purpose in trying to predict that kind of thing.
Nah.
But I think if you put the latest next to the oldest, the summer blue next to the original, it's a very interesting progression. I think having it be in that blue color just puts an exclamation point on that lineage.
Yeah. You know, if we are talking about the future, maybe things that we want, looking at this table, one thing's very clear to me, but I'm going to say it directly to camera. Hey, Omega, give us a couple sword hands.